So when we think about war, there's this almost romanticized idea, right? Rules, lines you don't cross.
Yeah, exactly.
We picture the Geneva Conventions, maybe the Red Cross symbol, a press badge, even just a white flag. There's this sort of historical expectation that certain boundaries, even in the middle of all the carnage, would actually hold.
And that's the theory, absolutely. That's the ideal we've held on to. But the brutal reality on the ground, whether you're talking about, say, a city crumbling under shell fire or a street choked with tear gas,
Right.
is that those lines are smudged at best, sometimes erased completely.
Erased.
And this deep dive, what we're getting into, it's exploring a really uncomfortable truth. The whole concept of neutrality, especially in military contexts, it's dying, or, maybe it's already dead.
And that's exactly what we're here to unpack for you today. We're going to dive into this huge shift, drawing from a stack of sources that honestly challenge our basic assumptions about who's a combatant and who's, well, a civilian anymore. We'll explore how battlefield logic has just fundamentally changed, everywhere from, Gaza to even protest sites right here like downtown Los Angeles.
And what's really crucial to get here is that this isn't some, wild conspiracy theory. It's not conjecture.
Yeah.
This is a documented doctrine. It's a mindset that's become, frankly, operational reality.
Yeah.
And we'll look at how it completely redefines roles we once thought were, sacred journalists, NGOs, medical staff.
Untouchable, almost.
Right. Understanding this structural change, it's absolutely vital for making sense of what's happening right now. It goes way beyond just judging things morally. It's about understanding the practical reality of how modern conflict actually works.
So to really dig into this, our sources point to some key things, historically and now, that got us here. We'll look at the legacy of the Vietnam War on military thinking.
Big one.
How organizations like JSOC, that's Joint Special Operations Command, the U.S. guys, how they view so-called neutral actors. We'll touch on the IDF model, what some sources call its ruthless efficiency. And maybe the most critical part for you listening, how your own digital footprint, your feed online, has literally become a kind of uniform in this new era.
Yeah, that's a huge piece. And it forces planners and observers, too, to ask a really uncomfortable question. If a population is genuinely oppressed by its internal rulers, where is the visible resistance against them?
Right. What does the lack of that resistance tell us about how people are aligned, especially when everything's so blended on the ground?
Exactly.
Okay, let's unpack this. Our sources are telling us, whether it's Gaza or downtown LA during a protest, the underlying logic is starting to look startlingly similar.
Yeah, it's this idea that you are a potential threat until proven otherwise. It's become a pervasive doctrine.
And a key takeaway seems to be, well, anyone who's actually operated in a modern conflict zone, Fallujah, Jenin, places like that, they often say the same thing.
They do. They'll tell you straight. There are no civilians. Not really. Not anymore. Those categories we thought were protected journalists, NGOs, charity workers, even medics, they're now viewed with suspicion by default. And in many places, treated that way. It's flipped from innocent until proven guilty to potential threat until proven otherwise.
But this shift, it isn't brand new, is it? It has deep roots.
Not at all.
Our sources point right back to the Vietnam War. That seems to be a pivotal moment that really reshaped American military psychology. We all know the images, the jungle ambushes.
Right.
But the overlooked lesson, maybe the harder one, was this idea that there was no reliable way to tell civilian from enemy. How did that experience turn into today's doctrine?
Well, that's the crux of it, isn't it? The Viet Cong, they didn't wear uniforms. You had children, elderly women acting as spotters, couriers, even suicide bombers sometimes. The enemy just melted into the population so completely that American soldiers and the French before them, by the way, they internalized this really grim maxim. The next person offering you something, maybe a fruit basket, could have it wired to explode.
God.
It created this situation where hesitation, pausing to think, is this person innocent, could literally get you killed. Presuming innocence became a luxury soldiers just couldn't afford. That etched a really profound, lasting psychological scar, especially for forces fighting in these asymmetric, messy environments. Survival trumped those traditional distinctions.
And that mindset just carried forward. We heard from a retired lieutenant colonel, DIA guy, embedded with JSE in Iraq.
Okay.
And he put it very bluntly. He said, on the ground, we never assumed an NGO was neutral. That's civilian cover until proven otherwise.
Wow, straight up.
And journos, forget it. They might be stringing for Al Jazeera feeding coordinates.
Yeah.
His point was, you clear a contact when you can, not before. He wasn't being cruel. He was just being precise from his perspective.
Right. Operational reality.
Yeah. In his world, that press vest wasn't a shield. It was actually a signal to vet them harder. What are the kind of wider implications when that becomes the default mindset?
Well, it becomes endemic. It spreads to every theater of modern war because the modern battlefield just isn't neat. It doesn't have clear lines or flags anymore.
Yeah.
It's networked. It's driven by narrative, by stories. And the enemy, whoever they are, often understands optics, the power of images, better than many generals do. And this just highlights how information itself is now a primary battleground. That changes how every single actor, whether they're perceived as neutral or not, gets assessed.
And our sources highlight the Israel Defense Forces, the IDF model, as maybe pushing this doctrine to its logical extreme, at least among Western-style militaries.
They're often pointed to, yeah.
They don't seem to pretend civilians are just civilians if they might be, say, logistics nodes for Hamas. They don't wait to find out if journalists are carrying mics or mortars. What are the sort of principles guiding that model in practice?
That's a really key point. You look at infamous cases like the Al Jazeera journalist Shireen Abu Akleh, killed in the West Bank. That illustrates this kind of brutal pragmatism. So do multiple strikes we've seen on aid convoys, on press buildings, even medical facilities in Gaza. Israel's doctrine, as our sources interpret it anyway, seems pretty simple. If it smells like a threat, you shoot first, then maybe investigate later.
Oof.
And look, while many condemn it internationally, you'll find few Western soldiers, especially American ones, who can honestly deny the tactical utility of that approach in a really complex, dangerous environment. It highlights this core tension, doesn't it? Military effectiveness versus those traditional international legal norms.
And maybe nowhere shows this breakdown of civilian protection more starkly than Gaza itself. You've got half the population under 18. Schools reportedly storing rockets. Mosques used as staging grounds. Apartment buildings becoming command posts.
And this raises that critical question, does that mean every single Gazan is a militant? Of course not. Absolutely not.
Yep.
But what it does mean, in the fog of war, is that no soldier feels they can afford to assume they're not. And this isn't about making a moral judgment on individuals. It's a structural point about operational reality.
Right.
When the terrain, the population, the logistics, when it's all blended together like that, war logic tends to fill in the blanks. The thinking becomes, if you're not actively fighting the insurgents in your neighborhood, well, maybe you are, at minimum, sort of, a co-survivor in a shared ideological space. Or maybe you're simply indistinguishable. That logic might be unfair, it might even be cruel, but it is the logic that often applies in these kinds of scenarios.
So what this all points to is that the sort of romantic era, the idea of medics and journalists as these sacred figures, untouchable, unarmed, unimpeachable, that's essentially over.
Yeah, pretty much.
No more MA-ish units operating with total impunity right in the middle of a war zone.
Exactly. We're now in the age of drone strikes on, say, Red Crescent hospitals.
Yeah.
We've seen tear gas used in medical tents at Standing Rock during the pipeline protests. We know about embedded journalists potentially leaking troop movements, deliberately or not, and riot police shooting rubber bullets straight into crowds of clearly marked press.
I remember seeing that Australian journalist in L.A. during the George Floyd protests hit live on air.
Exactly. In Ferguson, medics were tackled. In Ukraine, press convoys get shelled just like tanks sometimes. No badge, no vest, no emblem is universally respected anymore. It doesn't guarantee safety.
So why? Why this fundamental shift? Our sources seem to boil it down to one core idea. Narrative, the story, is now explicitly part of the battle space.
Yeah.
Everyone carries a potential narrative weapon.
That's a crucial point that comes out. A medic with a GoPro camera can potentially do more damage to a regime's legitimacy than an RPG.
Right.
A journalist flying a drone could, theoretically, feed targeting data. An aid worker with a big social media following can shift global opinion in real time. This is war fought in the age of live streams and hashtags. Yeah. And in that kind of space, every actor becomes a potential amplifier of enemy power, or at least a disruptor of your own narrative, so they get treated accordingly.
Which leads us to the really uncomfortable truth that while civilians absolutely still suffer in horrific numbers,
undeniably,
the idea that they're somehow insulated from the logic of total war seems to be increasingly a fiction.
And look, this isn't trying to apologize for war crimes. It's not an apologia. It's a diagnosis of an operational shift.
Okay.
In Gaza, in Afghanistan, Ukraine, even in American cities, During unrest, once the state activates its sort of war reflex, everyone gets scanned for threat potential. Not for moral worth, not for innocence, just simply threat potential.
And this collapse of the clear line between civilian and combatants, it doesn't just happen in dusty war zones overseas.
Yeah.
Our sources make it really clear it's happening at home, too.
Absolutely.
In how protests are policed, in drone policy discussions, in police training manuals. The idea that some people are just neutral bystanders.
Yeah.
It seems it's no longer operationally valid in many contexts. We've sort of entered an era of, what did one source call it? Total situational distrust.
Yeah, that captures it. Where your vest, your patch, your logo doesn't necessarily protect you anymore. It can actually mark you for extra scrutiny.
Right.
And given this new reality, our sources raise another really uncomfortable question. It's when military planners are basically forced to ask.
Okay.
When a population is truly, genuinely oppressed, occupied, terrorized by its own rulers, where's the visible resistance? Think about occupied France in World War II. Resistance fighters, they blew up train tracks, they assassinated collaborators. In Vietnam, yes, the line's blurred, but the will to resist the powers that be was everywhere. Even here in the U.S., opposition to power, historically, always produces visible friction. So where are they in Gaza?
Applying that lens.
Yeah.
Yeah. Where are the Gazan fraggers, so to speak? The sabotage cells targeting Hamas itself, not just the IDF, were the defectors, the bombings of Hamas arms depots, the disappearances of their commanders.
Right.
Our sources don't give a definitive answer, obviously, but they suggest maybe two possibilities.
Yeah.
Either Hamas is just incredibly effective at repression.
It's possible.
Or, maybe more complexly, the population has, for a whole mix of reasons, kind of absorbed Hamas into its identity to such a degree that internal resistance is minimal. It's not really an accusation, is it? It's more an invitation to consider that oppressed populations aren't always just passive victims waiting for rescue.
Exactly. Sometimes, tragically, they are participants or at least co-survivors within a shared ideology, and that just massively complicates the picture for anyone trying to draw clear lines from the outside.
So if we connect this back to the bigger picture,
it suggests that if a civilian population really truly wanted freedom from its own tyrants, you'd expect to see some broken windows on the inside too, In Iraq, in Afghanistan, coalition forces found translators, they found allies, there was internal opposition to the Taliban or Saddam. So the critical analytical question becomes, from an intelligence gathering perspective, where are those internal opposition groups in places like Gaza or similar blended environments?
And here's where it gets really relevant, maybe personally relevant to you listening. In 2025, your neutrality isn't decided by a physical press pass anymore or a Geneva Convention lanyard.
Nope.
It's increasingly decided by your digital signature, your tweets, your TikToks, your hashtags.
Yeah, something that really jumps out from the material is how open source intelligence, OSINT, has just completely obliterated plausible deniability.
Right.
Nobody on the battlefield or policing a protest trusts a flak jacket if they can just scroll through your public profile in 30 seconds. Every operator, from spec ops guys to domestic riot cops, they're now asking the same basic question: what side is this person really on? And the answer is often found not right there in the field, but in your feed. Think about it. A medic whose Instagram bio says Free Palestine, for certain intelligence analysts, that's a red flag. A journalist who tweeted ACA, all cops are bastards last summer, that suggests a potential partisan bias to law enforcement. An NGO worker who signs a public petition calling ICE agents kidnappers. In the eyes of those assessing threat, you're not neutral anymore.
Wow.
To the people holding the rifles, the people calling in airstrikes, ideology is a battlefield weapon, even if you're just typing on a keyboard. And when you're in a hot gun or even just a tense situation, everything is potential intelligence. Even your memes.
Even your memes.
You don't need a rifle to be seen as dangerous anymore. You just need reach, influence, perceived intent.
Which brings us finally to maybe the most fundamental question of all. What is a civilian anymore? I mean, look at a nation like the United States. We've got, over 400 million privately owned firearms?
Yeah, staggering number.
Millions of people with tactical knowledge, survivalist skills, a deep cultural obsession with freedom.
Yeah.
The whole idea of a passive civilian starts to get really blurry.
It really does. If America were ever invaded or occupied, a real Red Dawn scenario,
right,
would its civilians just be passive, cowering? Or would many of them become nighttime partisans? operating pipe bombs from garages, firing suppressed AR-15s from second-story windows.
It's plausible.
And this isn't just an American hypothetical. It applies anywhere populations are armed and ideologically engaged. The line between civilian and combatant has honestly never been thinner. Civilians today might be technically untrained, but they're often armed. They're not in uniform, but they're ideologically charged. Not formally enlisted, but fully engaged in wider cultural and political conflicts.
Yeah.
In this age of total information warfare, cheap drones, 3D printed weapons, digital psyops, narrative control, everyone is a potential threat vector. Everyone.
So let's just reiterate the profound shift we've been talking about today. The 20th century, it kind of gave us this myth of the sacred civilian, right? This idea of an innocent bystander, totally separate.
Right, that was the ideal. But the 21st century has introduced a radically different reality.
And how would you define that new reality precisely?
I think it's the era of the digitally active, ideologically exposed, often armed, and always analyzed non-combatant.
Wow.
The stark takeaway, really, in a practical, operational sense, is that there are no civilians anymore. Not in the traditional meaning of the word someone completely removed from the conflict's logic and potential impact.
So what does this all mean for you listening? If the fog of war isn't just a temporary condition anymore, but more like a default setting applied to basically everyone entering any kind of contested arena.
Yeah.
And if total situational distrust, as we called it, now governs interactions both in traditional war zones and increasingly at home, what does this mean for how we understand security, how we process information, and ultimately, what about our own roles in a world where neutrality seems dead and your digital footprint can literally be seen as your uniform?
It's a lot to think about.
Definitely something to reflect on, how you engage with information, how you present yourself, and just navigating this world around you.